It was Christmas Eve, 1887, and the Wyoming Territory lay wrapped in a thick blanket of snow. The cold winds howled across the vast, empty landscape, carrying with them a deep, endless silence. The snowflakes fell steadily, one after another, each a small, delicate flake that blended into the endless white. All that remained visible was the faint outline of a single cabin, weathered by time, standing firm in the middle of nowhere. Inside the cabin, Eli Mercer stood by the window, his eyes distant and lost in thought. The cold air from the outside crept in through the cracks of the old cabin, but Eli barely noticed it. His mind was elsewhere. His gaze was fixed on the emptiness beyond the glass, where the road disappeared into the swirling snowstorm. His heart felt as cold and hollow as the view before him, filled with memories of a life he once had, memories that lingered like shadows in the quiet. His wife, Sarah, had been taken from him 2 years ago by the fever, and with her, so much more had been lost. The love they shared, the warmth of their home, the joy that had once filled these walls, all gone. Now only silence and the weight of grief remained. Eli's hands gripped the windowsill, his knuckles white. His thick, weathered boots scraped the floorboards as he turned away from the window and walked toward the hearth. The fire inside crackled softly, barely enough to stave off the chill of the winter night. At the table, Hannah, his 6-year-old daughter, sat quietly, arranging pine cones in neat little rows. Her small hands worked diligently, but her mind was elsewhere. Her thoughts seemed far away, just as her father's had been. Every so often, her lips would hum a soft tune, a carol her mother used to sing, filling the otherwise still air with a faint echo of days gone by. Eli paused in the doorway, watching his daughter. The sight of her, so innocent and full of life, only made the pain inside him worse. She had been the only thing keeping him going, yet even her presence was not enough to fill the void that had swallowed him whole. "Papa, do you think she'll come today?" Hannah's voice broke through his thoughts, soft and hopeful, like a glimmer of light in the darkness. Eli's jaw tightened, and he didn't answer right away. He didn't want to answer. He couldn't bring himself to give her false hope. The mail-order bride he had written to was due to arrive that day, but Eli didn't know what to expect. He had answered the advertisement not because he believed in love, but because Hannah needed a mother and the homestead needed a woman's touch. It was a duty he couldn't ignore. "The stage is due at noon," Eli said, his voice flat, distant. "If she's coming, she'll be here." Hannah bounced on her heels, her excitement palpable. "I hope she's kind and pretty and likes Christmas." Eli didn't respond. He couldn't. What did it matter if she was kind or pretty? What did it matter if she liked Christmas? He didn't know if any of that was what mattered anymore. All he wanted was someone who could help him, someone who could take care of the homestead and, more importantly, take care of Hannah. Love was no longer part of the equation. A soft knock on the door startled them both. Hannah gasped, her eyes lighting up with anticipation. "She's here," Hannah whispered, barely able to contain her excitement. Eli's boots felt heavy as he crossed the cabin. His hand paused on the door latch, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He took a deep breath and then slowly opened the door. Outside, the snow whipped around the doorstep, and standing in the cold, her figure barely visible through the swirling flakes, was a woman. Margaret. She was wrapped in a thin shawl, and her dress was threadbare, patched in 3 places. Her shoes were worn through at the toes, and she clutched a single carpet bag with white knuckles. Eli's stomach dropped. This was not what he had expected. She spoke his name softly, as if unsure she had come to the right place. "Mr. Mercer?" The way she said it, with a mix of uncertainty and quiet desperation, made Eli's chest tighten. He stood frozen for a moment, staring at her, the woman who would be his wife, the woman he had agreed to marry out of duty, not desire. Behind him, Hannah pushed past his legs and hurried toward the stranger, her face lighting up like sunrise. "Papa, she's cold. Let her in." Eli looked at Margaret once more, his eyes filled with fear and confusion. What had he agreed to? What kind of life was this woman leaving behind? Yet before he could think further, Hannah had already reached out, taking Margaret's hand. Eli felt himself stuck, unable to move, as the wind howled around them. Margaret stepped across the threshold. Snowflakes melted on her patchwork shoulders like tears, but she held herself with a quiet dignity. Her spine was straight, her chin held high, as though no matter the cold, no matter the circumstances, she would not be bent. The door shut behind them, sealing out the winter winds. But the cold inside Eli's heart remained, even as the fire crackled warmly behind him. He didn't know what would come next. He didn't know if he was ready to let her in. It had been hours since Margaret arrived, and Eli still found himself pacing the cabin, his boots echoing against the wooden floor. The fire crackled, but the warmth it offered did little to soothe the cold tension in his chest. Every so often, he'd glance at the window, half expecting to see the snow still falling in thick sheets, as though the world outside was frozen in time, just like his own heart. He'd answered the advertisement out of duty, not desire. It was the responsible thing to do. Bring someone into his home to help with the farm and raise his daughter. Eli had never been a man driven by emotion. After Sarah's death, he hadn't had the time for love, for the gentler things in life. He'd closed himself off, burying his grief beneath a mountain of work. His heart had no room for hope or for another woman. When the letter had arrived, a part of him felt it was a chance to move forward, to fill the void in their lives with practicality. Hannah needed a mother, someone to guide her, teach her, be the woman Eli could never be. But did he want that for himself? Was he ready to share his life with a stranger, especially one who came from the poor, desperate circumstances Margaret did? It felt wrong, yet necessary. Eli had hoped for someone strong, someone who would get to work without complaint, a woman who would understand the harshness of life on the frontier. He didn't need a fairy tale or someone to fill the empty space left by Sarah. He simply needed help. The homestead wasn't something he could handle alone. He had built this life with his hands, but now he needed someone else to carry the weight. Hannah, on the other hand, was filled with excitement. Her little face had lit up the moment Margaret arrived, her innocent heart already reaching out for the woman who would become her new mother. Eli saw how Hannah hung on every word Margaret spoke, how she pulled the woman into their home with the kind of eagerness that only a child could possess. For her, this was the beginning of something new, a chance to have what she'd lost, a mother's love, a home that was whole again. But for Eli, it was far more complicated. He stood at the threshold of change, uncertain whether he was ready to move on, to open himself to someone new. He had promised his wife, Sarah, that he would take care of Hannah, that he would raise her right. But how could he do that when he still carried the weight of his wife's memory in his heart? How could he bring another woman into their home, knowing it would never be Sarah? Still, he couldn't ignore the quiet stirrings of hope in his heart, the hope that maybe, just maybe, this woman, this stranger, could bring some peace to their lives. But was he ready to take that leap? He caught sight of Hannah once again, her eyes sparkling with wonder as she helped Margaret prepare dinner, asking her questions about her life, about the things she'd seen. Eli couldn't help but notice how Margaret's patience with Hannah never wavered, how her calm demeanor seemed to settle the air around them. In that moment, Eli realized something he hadn't allowed himself to admit. He was watching this woman, not just as a solution to his problems, but as something more. Still, doubt gnawed at him. He wasn't ready. He couldn't be. The world outside had frozen in winter, and so had his heart. Hannah, unaware of her father's inner turmoil, bounced over to him with a bright smile. "Papa, do you think Miss Margaret will stay forever?" she asked. Her voice was full of innocence, full of hope. Eli looked down at her, a faint ache in his chest. "I don't know, sweetheart," he said, his voice soft but firm. "We'll just have to see." Hannah's face fell slightly at his words, but then she bounced back up. "I think she'll stay. She's nice. And she's pretty too." Her small hands reached up to tug at his sleeve. Eli looked over at Margaret, who was carefully stirring the pot on the stove. Her eyes met his for a brief moment, and he saw something in her gaze. Something gentle, something patient. In that brief exchange, he felt the first real flicker of hope in 2 years. Maybe this could work. Maybe they could have a future here, together. But could he truly open his heart again? Could he let go of the past to make room for the present? "I think you might be right, little one," Eli said softly. "Maybe she will stay." The fire crackled louder, as though the flames themselves were urging him to make a choice. As the evening wore on, Eli remained quiet, but in his heart, he knew something was changing. The cold outside didn't feel quite as bitter anymore. The fire in the hearth seemed a little brighter, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to wonder if, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he'd thought. The wind howled like a wild animal outside, carrying with it the sharp bite of winter. The snow was falling heavier than it had all season, each flake swirling in the bitter gusts until it seemed like the world was being swallowed by the white abyss. Inside the cabin, Eli stood near the window again, his back to the fire. His breath fogged up the glass as he stared out into the storm, waiting for something. Anything. The silence felt endless, and yet the outside world moved on, untouched by his grief. Then the quiet was shattered by a knock on the door. Eli's heart skipped. It was too early for anyone to be out in this weather, but he knew the stagecoach was due. He opened the door slowly, the cold air rushing in like an unwelcome guest. There, standing on the doorstep, was a woman, Margaret. She stood tall and strong despite the biting cold, her face pale and windburned. Her clothes were threadbare and patched in several places, and her shoes, barely more than scraps of leather, were barely enough to keep the frost from biting her toes. A single carpet bag hung from her hand, clutched tightly as though it were her only possession. Eli's chest tightened. This was not what he had expected. His mind raced as he took in the sight of her, a woman so out of place in his world, yet standing there, as if this was the only place she had left to go. He had expected someone more refined, someone who could fit into the role he needed her to play, a woman to run the house, help with the farm, and take care of his daughter. But Margaret, with her frail figure and weathered clothing, looked like someone who had already fought too many battles of her own. She didn't look like a woman he could depend on, and yet there was something in her eyes, a quiet determination that caught him off guard. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind howled around them, sending snowflakes swirling into the cabin like an invitation to escape the storm. But Eli couldn't move. He didn't know what to do with the woman standing in front of him, who looked as though she'd walked through hell to get here, only to find herself in the middle of nowhere. Margaret finally broke the silence. "Mr. Mercer?" Her voice was soft, hesitant, but steady. It was the voice of someone who had learned to fight for everything she had. Eli could only nod, his throat tight. He stepped aside, unsure of what to say or how to greet her. Before he could say anything, Hannah appeared from behind him, her little face lighting up with wonder at the sight of the woman standing in the doorway. "Papa, is she the one?" Hannah asked eagerly, her eyes wide with excitement. She darted forward, pulling at Margaret's hand as if they had known each other forever. "You're here! You're really here!" Eli watched, stunned, as his daughter took the stranger's hand, leading her inside as though there was no hesitation, no fear of the unknown. The little girl's pure joy and excitement shone in her eyes, and for a moment, Eli was torn between relief and disbelief. Margaret, for her part, seemed to accept the warmth of the invitation without hesitation, stepping across the threshold and into the warmth of the cabin. The wind slammed the door shut behind her, sealing her in with them. Hannah led Margaret toward the fire, chattering excitedly about all the things they would do together. Margaret listened quietly, nodding as she allowed herself to be guided, her gaze soft and patient. She didn't flinch at the cold that had clearly settled deep into her bones. Instead, she settled herself by the fire, her posture straight and dignified, even as her clothes clung to her skin from the journey. Eli stood frozen in the doorway, unsure of what to do. He watched as his daughter made herself at home, pulling a chair close to the fire for Margaret, offering her a mug of coffee. The simple gesture, so innocent and pure, struck Eli harder than he expected. Margaret's eyes met his across the room. She didn't seem afraid of him, didn't seem to notice his hesitation or discomfort. Her eyes were steady and calm, full of things Eli wasn't ready to face. He had expected a woman who would be frightened, who would feel out of place. But there was nothing fragile about Margaret. She was like the wind, unyielding and strong, no matter how fiercely it blew. Eli's chest tightened again, but this time it wasn't with doubt. It was a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years, the flicker of hope. But before he could think further, Hannah's voice rang out, breaking the silence again. "Papa, she's cold. Can we give her some warm food? Mama used to make us soup when it snowed like this." Margaret gave her a soft smile, her lips trembling slightly from the cold. "I'd like that very much," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Eli didn't know why, but his heart softened. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel as alone as he had the past 2 years. He stepped forward, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. But before he could speak, he found himself opening the cupboard, setting the kettle on the stove, and preparing a meal without thinking. In that moment, for the first time in 2 years, the house felt like it might actually be home again. The days that followed were filled with a strange kind of quiet. The storm had passed, but the cold lingered. Margaret had settled into the cabin with a quiet grace, her presence now a steady hum beneath the hum of everyday life. She helped with the chores, tended the fire, and quietly filled the spaces that had been hollow for so long. But Eli wasn't sure what to make of it all. He watched her carefully, always a step behind, never quite allowing himself to fully let her in. His mind still whispered doubts. She was an outsider, a woman who had come from a life he couldn't understand. She was different, too different. Yet in the days that followed, something in Margaret's quiet strength began to chip away at Eli's resolve. She wasn't what he had expected, but then again, nothing in his life had turned out the way he had expected. One morning he watched from the doorway as Margaret sat with Hannah, teaching her how to fold the laundry. The two of them sat on the floor in front of the hearth, their heads bent in quiet concentration. Hannah's small hands struggled to fold the fabric properly, but Margaret patiently corrected her, showing her how to smooth out the wrinkles, how to fold the edges just so. It was a simple thing, nothing grand, nothing heroic. But there was something in Margaret's actions that struck Eli deeply. Her hands, though rough from the journey, moved with such care. Her voice, gentle as she explained each step to Hannah, held a warmth Eli hadn't heard in this cabin for years. "Like this, little one," Margaret said softly, showing Hannah how to fold the cloth again, her eyes sparkling with something like pride. "It's all about being patient, you see. Even the smallest task deserves respect." Hannah looked up at Margaret with admiration, her face alight with joy. "I'm gonna be just like you when I'm grown up," she said, her words simple but full of meaning. Eli stood in the doorway, his arms crossed over his chest. He felt an odd knot form in his stomach as he watched them. Margaret was more than just a woman who had come to fill a role in their home. She was someone who cared, who was showing Hannah, his daughter, how to be strong, how to be patient, how to approach the world with grace. And yet a voice in his mind still asked, what if she's not what she seems? Eli had no answers. He didn't know who Margaret truly was, what her past was like, what she had endured to get here. All he knew was that she had arrived at his doorstep with nothing but a few possessions and a willingness to start anew. But who did that make her? A woman of value or simply a woman desperate for a new life? As the day wore on, Eli couldn't shake the feeling that something in his home had begun to change. It wasn't just the way Hannah smiled more, or how the house seemed warmer, even when the wind howled outside. It was the way Margaret moved, like she had always belonged here, as though she had a quiet claim to the place that Eli had never thought anyone could fill but himself. That evening, as they sat around the table for supper, Eli couldn't help but notice the way Margaret had settled into her new life. She spoke gently with Hannah, telling her stories of her people, stories of the Apache, stories of strength and survival, of a life lived with dignity no matter the hardships. The firelight flickered on her face, casting shadows that made her seem almost otherworldly. Hannah, of course, hung on every word. She loved these tales, and in her childlike innocence, she believed every one of them to be true. But Eli, he only listened. He watched her, his mind a swirl of questions, a swirl of doubt. Was he being too harsh, he asked himself, his jaw tightening. Was it just his grief, still so fresh, that kept him at arm's length? The next morning, Eli watched as Margaret worked. She moved with purpose. And despite the ragged clothes she still wore, there was nothing weak about her. She carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had known hardship but refused to let it define her. She handled the task with care, from mending the clothes to sweeping the floor. Eli could see the effort she put into everything she did. She worked hard, harder than many women he knew, harder than he ever expected from someone in her position. He had thought she was weak, someone who would break under the weight of their life here. But she wasn't. She wasn't weak at all. As the days passed, Eli felt himself slowly giving in to something he hadn't expected. The distance between himself and Margaret began to close, but not out of some romantic notion. It wasn't love, not yet, but he was starting to realize that Margaret's value was not defined by the rags she wore, but by the strength, the character, and the grace she carried herself with, day in and day out. He wasn't sure what this would mean in the long run. He wasn't sure what his heart was telling him, but for the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel. Respect. The days had grown colder, the chill of the winter seeping deeper into the bones of the town. The first whispers had started, carried on the wind like smoke, spreading through the tight-knit community. Margaret, the Apache woman who had come to Eli Mercer's cabin, was a subject of conversation in every corner of town. The news had traveled fast, and as it always did, the gossip followed closely behind. They called her many things: dirty, unworthy, a disgrace, as if a woman's worth could be measured by the clothes she wore, the skin she was born into. The townsfolk, mostly white settlers, had never seen an Apache woman take a man's name, especially not in the home of a respected man like Eli. It was a scandal in the making, and they were eager to talk about it. Margaret's arrival had unsettled them all, poking holes in the stories they had woven about what was acceptable, what was right. The townspeople had been patient at first, giving Eli the benefit of the doubt, but the whispers grew louder as the days went on. Margaret was now a regular presence in town, attending the small gatherings at the general store, or crossing paths with the women on their way to fetch water. Every time she appeared, the talk grew a little more pointed, a little more judgmental. One afternoon, when the wind was howling harder than usual, a group of women appeared at the cabin's door. Eli had seen them from the window, a tight group of gossiping faces framed by their bonnets and shawls. The leader of the group, Widow Carson, was at the front. She was known for her sharp tongue and her inclination to meddle in matters that didn't concern her. Eli knew what they wanted before they even knocked. He opened the door, not out of anger, but because he knew the confrontation was inevitable. The women stood on the porch, their expressions tight and disapproving. Behind them, the cold wind blew through the empty fields, a stark contrast to the warmth inside the cabin. "Eli Mercer," Widow Carson began, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "We've been meaning to speak to you about this woman you've taken in." Eli stiffened, his jaw tightening. He knew what was coming. He stepped aside to let them in, though he didn't want to. He didn't want to invite trouble into his home. But the women pushed past him, entering with their judgment already in their eyes. "It's a shame," another woman said, shaking her head, "to let a woman like that into your house, especially with your daughter there. What kind of example are you setting?" Eli remained silent, his gaze hardening. The words stung, but he had heard them all before. The prejudice, the disgust, the fear they felt for anything outside their own narrow world. They didn't understand Margaret. They didn't care to. Widow Carson was relentless. "She's an Apache, Eli." Her words were like daggers, sharp and cutting. "She's not fit to be in the company of decent folk. She's a disgrace to your wife's memory and to your daughter." Eli's fist clenched, but he bit back the words that burned on his tongue. He knew Margaret's worth, but these women didn't, and no matter what he said, they wouldn't understand. Margaret, who had been sitting by the fire, her face calm and unreadable, stood up. She looked at Eli, her gaze steady. Without a word, she walked toward the door. She knew what was coming, but she would not be driven out. Her silence was her strength. "I will leave if you wish," Margaret said, her voice soft but firm. "But I won't apologize for who I am." Eli looked at her, his heart tight in his chest. The women stood behind him, their faces expectant, eager to see her leave. But Margaret's dignity held her tall, and her silence spoke louder than any words could. "No, Margaret," Eli said, his voice rough. He turned to the women, his voice rising. "You may not like her. You may not approve of her, but you will respect her. She has done nothing wrong." The room fell silent, and for the first time, Eli's voice was clear and strong, not for the women, but for Margaret. The words carried weight, the weight of his decision, and the weight of his growing respect for the woman standing beside him. Widow Carson and the others looked at him stunned. They had expected him to apologize, to send Margaret away like a dog. But Eli Mercer was no longer the man they had known. He wasn't going to hide in shame, and he wasn't going to bend to their narrow-minded views. With a sharp look at the group, Eli added, "She stays, and if you can't accept that, Then you can leave. The women, to their credit, didn't argue further. They exchanged glances, their faces tight, but they knew they couldn't force Eli into a decision he didn't want to make. One by one, they left, the sound of their footsteps fading into the cold evening air. Eli stood at the door, his hand resting on the frame, his heart racing. He had just made a choice that would likely drive him farther from this town, farther from the people who had always been his neighbors. But he didn't care. Margaret's worth was not for them to decide. The days had begun to blur into one another, the winter still holding its grip on the land. Inside the cabin, however, a subtle change was taking place. Eli had noticed it in the way Hannah now carried herself. She was more vibrant, more alive in a way he hadn't seen in months. Margaret's presence had a way of filling the house with warmth, even on the coldest of days. It wasn't just the chores Margaret helped with, nor the way she had mended the broken furniture and patched up the cabin. It was the way she had begun to teach Hannah, not just how to handle a broom or prepare a meal, but how to stand tall in the world, even when life was against you. One afternoon, after the day's work was done and the fire crackled low in the hearth, Hannah and Margaret were sitting together by the fire. They were playing a game of cards, laughing and chattering. Margaret's soft laughter filled the room, but it was the words she spoke to Hannah that caught Eli's attention. "You have to be patient, little one." Margaret's voice was calm but firm. "Strength is born from patience, and a woman, especially one like you, must be strong, no matter what." Hannah looked up at her, eyes wide with curiosity. "But how do I do that?" she asked, her voice quiet but earnest. Margaret smiled, her eyes softening. She leaned in closer, lowering her voice so only Hannah could hear. "A woman's strength is in her heart. It is in the way she carries herself, in the way she keeps her head high, even when the world tries to bring her down. The world may not always be kind, but we must stand strong." Hannah nodded, though her small face held a hint of uncertainty. "Like you, Miss Margaret?" she asked. Margaret chuckled softly, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear. "Like me, little one. And like your mother, I'm sure." Eli stood by the door, watching them from the shadows, his heart heavy. The words Margaret spoke resonated in ways he didn't expect. He hadn't heard anyone speak like that in a long time. His own mother had been strong like that, but he hadn't thought of her in years. Margaret's words struck something deep inside him. A longing he hadn't known was there, for the strength and resilience he'd seen in both his wife, Sarah, and in Margaret. His gaze softened, but a part of him still held back. He had grown used to keeping his emotions locked away, to not letting anyone in. But Margaret wasn't just a stranger anymore. She was becoming something more. He had been so focused on his own grief, so consumed by the memories of Sarah, that he hadn't allowed himself to see what was standing before him. Margaret was not just the woman he had reluctantly invited into his home. She was someone strong, someone capable, someone who could teach his daughter things that Eli didn't know how to express. Margaret was showing Hannah how to be strong, but in doing so, she was also showing Eli something about himself, about how he had been hiding from life, hiding from the future, hiding from love. Eli turned away from the door, his mind racing. He went to the kitchen to prepare supper, but his thoughts were far from the work at hand. "Papa, can I tell you something?" Hannah's voice broke through his thoughts. Eli turned to find his daughter standing in the doorway, her eyes shining with excitement. "What is it, sweetheart?" he asked, forcing a smile as he set the pot on the stove. Hannah walked over and stood beside him, her small hands wringing together in her excitement. "Miss Margaret says I'm strong. She says I have a big heart, just like Mama." She looked up at him, her face full of innocence and hope. "Do you think so, Papa?" Eli's heart tightened in his chest. He didn't know what to say. For so long, he had been too caught up in his own pain to see how his daughter needed him, to see how she needed someone to help her grow, someone to guide her. He had been so fixated on his grief that he hadn't noticed the changes in Hannah. Looking at her now, standing there with a smile that could light up the whole room, Eli saw something he hadn't seen in a long time. Hope. "I think you're stronger than you know, little one," Eli said, his voice thick with emotion. Hannah smiled brightly, then ran back to the fire to continue playing with Margaret. Eli watched them for a moment longer, his thoughts a tangle of confusion and longing. For the first time in years, he didn't feel so alone. But it wasn't just because of Hannah. It was because of Margaret, too. Her quiet strength, her resilience, her willingness to step into his life and offer not just help but heart, it was changing him. And for the first time, he allowed himself to wonder what the future might hold. The days had begun to blur into one another, the winter still holding its grip on the land. Inside the cabin, however, a subtle change was taking place. Eli had noticed it in the way Hannah now carried herself. She was more vibrant, more alive in a way he hadn't seen in months. Margaret's presence had a way of filling the house with warmth, even on the coldest of days. It wasn't just the chores Margaret helped with, nor the way she had mended the broken furniture and patched up the cabin. It was the way she had begun to teach Hannah, not just how to handle a broom or prepare a meal, but how to stand tall in the world, even when life was against you. One afternoon after the day's work was done, and the fire crackled low in the hearth, Hannah and Margaret were sitting together by the fire. They were playing a game of cards, laughing and chattering. Margaret's soft laughter filled the room, but it was the words she spoke to Hannah that caught Eli's attention. "You have to be patient, little one." Margaret's voice was calm but firm. "Strength is born from patience, and a woman, especially one like you, must be strong, no matter what." Hannah looked up at her, eyes wide with curiosity. "But how do I do that?" she asked, her voice quiet but earnest. Margaret smiled, her eyes softening. She leaned in closer, lowering her voice so only Hannah could hear. "A woman's strength is in her heart. It is in the way she carries herself, in the way she keeps her head high, even when the world tries to bring her down. The world may not always be kind, but we must stand strong." Hannah nodded, though her small face held a hint of uncertainty. "Like you, Miss Margaret?" she asked. Margaret chuckled softly, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear. "Like me, little one, and like your mother, I'm sure." Eli stood by the door, watching them from the shadows, his heart heavy. The words Margaret spoke resonated in ways he didn't expect. He hadn't heard anyone speak like that in a long time. His own mother had been strong like that, but he hadn't thought of her in years. Margaret's words struck something deep inside him. A longing he hadn't known was there, for the strength and resilience he'd seen in both his wife, Sarah, and in Margaret. His gaze softened, but a part of him still held back. He had grown used to keeping his emotions locked away, to not letting anyone in. But Margaret wasn't just a stranger anymore. She was becoming something more. He had been so focused on his own grief, so consumed by the memories of Sarah, that he hadn't allowed himself to see what was standing before him. Margaret was not just the woman he had reluctantly invited into his home. She was someone strong, someone capable, someone who could teach his daughter things that Eli didn't know how to express. Margaret was showing Hannah how to be strong, but in doing so, she was also showing Eli something about himself, about how he had been hiding from life, hiding from the future, hiding from love. Eli turned away from the door, his mind racing. He went to the kitchen to prepare supper, but his thoughts were far from the work at hand. "Papa, can I tell you something?" Hannah's voice broke through his thoughts. Eli turned to find his daughter standing in the doorway, her eyes shining with excitement. "What is it, sweetheart?" he asked, forcing a smile as he set the pot on the stove. Hannah walked over and stood beside him, her small hands wringing together in her excitement. "Miss Margaret says I'm strong. She says I have a big heart, just like Mama." She looked up at him, her face full of innocence and hope. "Do you think so, Papa?" Eli's heart tightened in his chest. He didn't know what to say. For so long, he had been too caught up in his own pain to see how his daughter needed him, to see how she needed someone to help her grow, someone to guide her. He had been so fixated on his grief that he hadn't noticed the changes in Hannah. Looking at her now, standing there with a smile that could light up the whole room, Eli saw something he hadn't seen in a long time. Hope. "I think you're stronger than you know, little one," Eli said, his voice thick with emotion. Hannah smiled brightly, then ran back to the fire to continue playing with Margaret. Eli watched them for a moment longer, his thoughts a tangle of confusion and longing. For the first time in years, he didn't feel so alone. But it wasn't just because of Hannah, it was because of Margaret too. Her quiet strength, her resilience, her willingness to step into his life and offer not just help but heart. It was changing him. And for the first time, he allowed himself to wonder what the future might hold. The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes with the deep, cold stillness of winter. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, but the wind still howled, sending the occasional gust of icy air through the cracks of the cabin. Inside, though, there was a warmth that Eli hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Margaret sat by the fire, her face bathed in the soft light of the flames, while Hannah had long since fallen asleep, her small form curled up in the chair beside the hearth. The house was peaceful now, calm. The tension that had gripped it for so long seemed to have lifted. It wasn't just the work getting done. It was the space Margaret had carved out in their lives, the quiet strength she had brought into their home. Eli stood by the window looking out into the night. He was no longer watching for the storm. Now it was something deeper that kept him rooted in place, the stirrings of a feeling he had kept buried for too long. He didn't know what to do with it, but he couldn't deny it. The walls he had built around himself were starting to crumble, and it was terrifying. He turned away from the window, his gaze falling on Margaret, who was sitting with her hands folded in her lap. Her eyes were closed, but she wasn't sleeping. There was a quiet strength in her, a steadfastness that Eli had only begun to understand. The more he saw of her, the more he realized that Margaret was the woman he had been missing, not just in his life, but in his heart. He walked over to her slowly, his boots quiet on the wooden floor. He hesitated, unsure if he was doing the right thing, unsure of what would happen if he opened up. But in that moment, he knew he couldn't keep living in the shadows of his past. He had spent so much time trying to bury his feelings, trying to hold everything together, but Margaret had changed that. She had shown him what it meant to live fully again, to be alive, to feel something real. When he reached her, he knelt down, his eyes locking with hers. She didn't pull away, but there was something in her gaze, a flicker of surprise perhaps. She was still the same woman who had walked into his life like a stranger, but now she was someone he couldn't imagine living without. "I've been wrong, Margaret," Eli said, his voice low and thick with emotion. "I've been wrong about a lot of things, about you, about us, about what really matters." He took a deep breath, the weight of his words heavier than the winter air around them. Margaret didn't speak at first. She simply looked at him, her eyes soft but unwavering. She waited for him to continue as if she already knew what he was about to say. "You're not what I expected," Eli went on, his voice breaking with a hint of a vulnerability. "But you're everything I never knew I needed. You have more strength in you than I ever thought possible. And what's more, you've given me something I haven't had in years. Peace." Eli swallowed hard. It felt like a weight was lifting off his chest as he said the words. "I don't want you to stay here because you feel obligated, Margaret. I want you to stay because I respect you, I admire you, and because I need you," he added quietly, his voice barely a whisper, as if saying it aloud would make it real. There was a long silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound that filled the space between them. Then Margaret reached out, her hand resting gently on his. Her touch was warm, reassuring, and Eli felt a rush of emotions flood through him. Relief, gratitude, and the beginning of something deeper. "You've already given me so much, Eli," she said softly, her voice steady, but there was an unmistakable tenderness in it. "I stayed because I wanted to, because I saw something in you, something worth fighting for." Eli's heart swelled in his chest, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt a sense of certainty, a sense of belonging. He wasn't alone anymore. They weren't alone, and the future, whatever it might hold, didn't seem quite as terrifying. "I don't know what the future holds," Eli said, his voice full of a newfound resolve, "but I want to face it with you. I want to make a life with you, not because I have to, but because I choose to." Margaret smiled, her eyes bright with something Eli hadn't seen in a long time. "Hope. Then we'll face it together, Eli," she replied, her voice soft but sure. "Together." And for the first time in years, Eli believed it. The weight that had been hanging over him lifted completely, and the fire that had been kindling between them finally began to burn bright. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the quiet town. It was Sunday, the day the town gathered at the small church on the hill, and as usual, the streets were filled with chatter and movement. But this time, there was something different about the scene. As Eli, Margaret, and Hannah made their way to the church, all eyes were on them. The gossip had spread like wildfire, and now the townsfolk couldn't seem to look away. Eli had heard the whispers, felt the eyes burning into his back as they walked. Every few steps, a head would turn, or a voice would drop low in the conversation. He knew what they were saying. He had heard the talk before, felt the sharp sting of their judgment, but today it didn't matter. He had promised himself that he would no longer let their voices dictate his choices. The fire in his chest had been burning for days now, an anger, a determination that had grown stronger each time he saw how Margaret stood tall, despite it all. The way she walked into the world, facing it with a strength that Eli had only begun to understand. As they entered the church, Eli felt the weight of the stairs. He felt the shift in the air, the tension thick enough to cut. He could hear the murmurs, feel the shift in the atmosphere. But instead of shrinking from it, he stood a little taller, a little firmer. They sat in the back as usual, Margaret beside him, Hannah nestled between them. The quiet of the church was almost deafening, the hum of the people's quiet judgments louder than any spoken word. But Eli didn't care. He wasn't there for them. He wasn't there to answer their questions or their criticisms. The preacher went on with his sermon, his words drifting in and out of Eli's mind. But then, as the service came to a close, Eli felt something stir inside him. He didn't know what came over him, but in that moment, he couldn't sit back any longer. He stood up suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. Margaret looked at him in surprise, but Eli's gaze never wavered. He turned toward the front of the church, facing the congregation. The silence that followed felt as heavy as the snow outside. "I've been thinking a lot about this. About all of this," Eli said, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the silence like a blade. The congregation fell still, waiting. "I've been hearing what's been said. I've seen the looks, and I know what you're thinking." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. There were faces of disbelief, faces of judgment, but there were also those who had been silent, those who watched him closely, as if waiting for him to speak. "But here's the thing," Eli continued, his voice growing stronger. "Margaret deserves more than your judgment. She deserves your respect. She deserves the same respect any woman in this town would get, no matter her skin, her past, or her name." His words echoed in the quiet church, and for a moment it felt like the whole town was holding its breath. What matters in this world is a person's character, not their bloodline. Margaret is here because she has more strength in her than I could ever hope for. She's the one who's been teaching my daughter what it means to be strong and kind. She's the one who's been showing us both what it means to live with dignity, even when the world wants to tear you down. Eli's chest swelled with something fierce as he spoke, as if the weight of his words was finally being lifted. "So if you think she doesn't belong here, if you think she's not good enough, then you're wrong, and I won't stand by and let it continue." He turned toward Margaret, his hand reaching out to her, a symbol of his unwavering support. Margaret's eyes met his, and for the first time Eli saw not just the woman he had come to admire, but the woman he had been missing all along. "I don't need your approval," Eli said, his voice quiet but resolute. "But Margaret does, and she deserves it." For a long moment, the silence hung thick in the air, and Eli wasn't sure if the town would ever accept him or Margaret. But in that moment, it didn't matter. He had said what needed to be said. He had taken the first step toward the life he wanted to build. One with Margaret, with Hannah, with respect, no matter the judgment that came from others. Slowly, the murmur of conversation started up again, but this time, there was no malice in it. There were still glances, but something had changed, and for the first time in a long while, Eli felt like he could breathe. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, but it would be theirs to walk, together. The air had finally begun to warm. The biting cold that had gripped the land for so long was beginning to loosen its hold, and the first signs of spring were starting to show. Eli had never been one for grand gestures or speeches, but as he stepped outside that morning, something inside him shifted. He had spent so many years building walls, trying to keep the world at a distance. But now, as he stood in the soft morning light, the world didn't seem so cold anymore. The snow had started to melt, but in its place, a different kind of beauty had emerged. As Eli walked down the path to the barn, his boots crunching on the thawing earth, he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. A small patch of crocus flowers, their purple petals bright against the white of the last remaining patches of snow. He bent down to touch them, his fingers brushing the delicate flowers. A symbol of new beginnings, he thought. It was a small thing, but in that moment, it felt like everything was changing. The world was coming back to life, and so were they. Back at the cabin, Margaret was in the kitchen, humming a tune as she worked. Hannah was beside her, rolling out dough for bread, her small hands moving with surprising skill. The house felt different now, filled with the sounds of daily life, laughter, the clatter of utensils, the smell of bread baking. It was a home in every sense of the word. Eli stepped inside, wiping his boots on the mat by the door. He watched them for a moment. Margaret and Hannah, the two women who had brought life back to his world. He had never imagined a life like this. He had never imagined a love like this. He went to the table, where Hannah had laid out a small bouquet of flowers, wildflowers picked from the field near the cabin. Margaret had taught her to gather them, to appreciate the small things in life, to notice the beauty in the world even in the most difficult of times. Eli couldn't help but smile. He had been so focused on surviving, on working through the pain, that he had forgotten what it meant to truly live. But Margaret had reminded him. "I found some crocus flowers this morning," Eli said, his voice soft, filled with something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Hope. He looked at Hannah, then at Margaret. "It's a sign, don't you think?" Margaret turned, her smile warm. "A sign of what?" she asked, her voice gentle, but with a knowing look in her eyes. She already knew the answer. "A sign that we've made it through," Eli said, his voice steady, as if he was finally able to say what he had been holding inside for so long. "That the worst is behind us, and now it's time for something better." Hannah looked up at him, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Does that mean we can finally have a real family now, Papa?" she asked, her voice hopeful, full of the innocence that only a child could possess. Eli knelt down beside her, his heart full. "Yes, sweetheart, that's exactly what it means." He looked over at Margaret, his heart swelling with a love he couldn't quite put into words. This was his family now, and nothing would ever break them apart. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. There was work to be done, but for the first time in a long while, Eli didn't mind. There was laughter in the cabin, warmth in the air, and love filling every corner of their home. They were no longer just surviving, they were living. As evening fell and the sky turned a deep shade of purple, the three of them sat down to dinner together. Eli, Margaret, and Hannah. The table was small, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that they were together, that they had found each other amidst the struggles, amidst the harsh winters and the storms. They had created something real, a family, a home. And as Eli looked out the window at the stars beginning to shine in the clear night sky, he knew that this was only the beginning. They had made it through the worst of the storm, and now the future lay before them, full of promise. Spring had come to the land, and with it, a new beginning.